Welcome back to the Lutheran History Podcast. We are today doing part 2 of our interview with Pastor Peter Prange about his book concerning the doctrine of fellowship within the Missouri Synod. Last time we wrapped up really only getting to the beginning of the founding of the Missouri Synod, but a lot of the context, but also the close to a decade of history leading up to that event. So today, Peter, do you want to talk about some of those early controversies? I think the Missourians, we established the relationship with Grabau and the Buffalo Synod, but also we introduced the figure of Wilhelm Loehe. Could you compare for us briefly the positions of both Grabau and Loehe concerning the doctrines of church and ministry? They're kind of key to understand.
Sure. It's always a little bit of a challenge, or maybe you're walking on eggshells when you begin comparing one to the other. There are a lot of similarities for sure. In fact, there are frankly so many similarities between these early Lutherans when it comes to their doctrine of church and ministry, and yet the differences, the nuances between them were significant enough that it would often end in some type of a dispute. It seems as if, and Loehe says as much, he really was more comfortable with Grabau's position on church and ministry than Walther's. The thing that Loehe and Grabau held in common, it seems, was quite a bit of distrust for a democratic way of making decisions. They firmly believed that the pastors, the clergy, should be in the forefront of just about any decision that's made within a congregation. The one place where Loehe was not comfortable with Grabau's position was Grabau and some of his fellow pastors in the Buffalo Synod were pretty insistent that unless the pastor is telling you to do something that is sinful, that you have to obey him in all things. So the famous example from a Milwaukee congregation where a guy named Krause was pastor, he insisted that his congregation buy him a horse and buggy so he could make his way back and forth between Freistadt and Milwaukee. And when the people were unwilling to supply him with that, he excommunicated a bunch of them. Mm-hmm. So Loehe would say that's going a step too far when it comes to the obedience that is owed to a pastor of a congregation. But they both, Loehe and Grabau, were very, very concerned about the clergy ceding too much of its authority or power to the laity. And of course, another main similarity between the two was they held the rite of ordination up very high to the point of really calling it divinely instituted. It was absolutely necessary that a man be ordained by fellow pastors, even to the point, Loehe suggested, that you have a bit of apostolic succession going on there. And so that, especially on the American scene, that's what put them at odds with the Missourians. The Saxons especially were concerned about anything that smelled remotely like the Stephen debacle that they had to endure when they first came to America. And so when they heard that kind of language, they kind of figured that's the way the wind was blowing, and they did not like the wind blowing that direction.
Yeah, so could we contrast Walther then with, I guess, both the Loehe and the Grabau positions a little bit too, just to understand that, because that's the point of tension that we're leading up to.
Sure. Walther, of course, famously talked about how really the office of ministry is given to all Christians, meaning that we are all ultimately called, even in our baptisms, the priesthood of all believers, to share the good news of salvation and forgiveness, and that we've been given this authority as Christians, each and every one of us, to announce forgiveness in the name of Jesus, but that the congregation then also transfers the power of the keys publicly to one person or a number of people within the congregation to do that gospel ministry on behalf of the congregation or publicly. Again, from Grabau and Loehe's perspective, that put way too much authority in the hands of the laity. They saw office of ministry being handed down from one clergy member to another clergy member. So, of course, Walther really emphasizing the freedom of the gospel in a new American scene. That was very appealing, of course, to American Christians as well. And Missouri had the advantage early on, especially those Saxons, of having some really gifted lay people, laymen, spiritually gifted, even to the point, I can't remember if it was Grabau or Loehe, who even had to admit, if we all had lay people like you have, it may be a little bit different situation, that we would be willing to cede them more of this authority. But the fact of the matter is, the average layperson is more a sheep than a shepherd. And so we need to be able to draw those distinctions more carefully, they argued.
Yeah, interesting letter I found in my own research. I think it was from Sealer to Wyneken. He's saying, there's nothing wrong with Walther's point of view, which I think is why they were able to go on fellowship, because they agreed on, what's okay or not. But he said, we can't run a congregation the same way as you're doing in Missouri. We just don't have the kind of biblically educated laity like you guys do. So I think that they recognized that as they came together and made adjustments accordingly.
Right.
And that's the difference, though. Like Grabau would just flat out reject that appropriate flexibility.
Correct. Yeah. When one of Loehe's men, Lochner, came to St. Louis and saw the interaction between Walther as pastor and some of these very, very educated laymen, he was just astounded at the ability that some of those lay people in the St. Louis congregation especially had. So it was a rather unique situation. It does seem to be the case.
So Loehe also, I guess nervous was maybe the words I would come up with just to describe him. He was just really uneasy with this whole way Missouri was going to go about doing things, and it turned out to be then the predominant kind of standard way of running a congregation with their understanding of church and ministry. He responded to that with his Zugabe, but what did he hope to accomplish with that? And then what did it actually end up accomplishing?
Well, he did offer his aphorisms on ministry, which were an aphorism is kind of your musings on something. It always seemed like Loehe was a little bit hesitant to come down too absolutely on any point. He always wanted to have a little bit of wiggle room. And he added this addition, this Zugabe, to his aphorisms a couple of years after he first published his aphorisms. It seems as if what he was really aiming for in that was to do his best to lay down what the differences were between Walther and the Missourians and Grabau and his Buffalo Synod, and to point out to them from his perspective where he thought each of them was correct in their perspective, where each of them was wrong in their perspective, and trying to find a way to find some middle ground. And when you read it through to its entirety, what you really find is he's really emphasizing the matter of church fellowship. What is the standard, the necessary standard of agreement for folks to be in church fellowship? And he just really believed, apparently from the bottom of his heart, that even though Grabau and Walther had some disagreements about church and ministry issues, that these really shouldn't be divisive of church fellowship, that they should be together, and that it would be for the good of the church, the American Lutheran Church, that these men and their two church bodies find a way to work together, and of course he along with them as well. What ended up happening, a long story that we can't go into here for sure, but I guess nuts and bolts of it was Walther was convinced that the doctrine of church and ministry, or doctrines of church and ministry, had been settled in the Lutheran confessions. That's where we find our Lutheran understanding of what the scriptures teach on these doctrines. And so this question has been settled. This is what Lutherans confess and believe. We find it, for instance, in Augsburg Confession 5 and Augsburg Confession 14, and of course, other places in the Lutheran confessions. And where he really got to be very uncomfortable was with Loehe, was that Loehe was really taking the confessions as being historical documents that were not necessarily the last word on what Lutherans confess, teach, and believe. And he wanted to take an approach which would allow for additional doctrinal development. He was very interested in exegesis. He felt like there were still things to be found in the scriptures. It wasn't just in this area of doctrine, but this was kind of where it began to show itself. And from Walther's perspective, that was really what separated them, because once you start taking some of that foundation, what Walther would call the organic foundation of our Christian faith, which is the scriptures, once you start taking away one brick of that organic foundation and saying, well, we're not entirely sure what the scriptures teach here, well, you begin to have this domino effect, he feared, where, well, the scriptures, if the scriptures and the confessions are not clear here, then how can we say that they're clear here and here and here and here and here? And now all of these, as Loehe called them, open questions, they predominate in our theology, and we're left with no certainty whatsoever. In a lot of ways, I kind of compared that whole debate between Walther and Loehe to the debate between Luther and Erasmus, where Erasmus really wanted to have kind of an open question approach to the question of the bondage of the will. And Luther, he liked assertions. He believed it was really important to be clear. This is what we believe, teach, and confess. And that, more than anything else, was the crux of the matter, it seems, between Walther and Loehe. And that's really where there was a division, a parting of the ways.
So maybe we don't have time to get into all the back and forths, but you document the trip that Walther and the Missouri Synod President Wyneken took back to meet with Loehe. Do you think that Walther showed his customary patience with Loehe, dealing with him and their doctrinal differences that as they grew and developed?
Yeah, they did seem to have a very interesting relationship, no question about it. From my research, I at least discovered or have come to the conclusion that from the earliest days, Walther always seemed to have a little bit of suspicion when it came to Loehe. I wonder, honestly, I never came across him saying it, but I wonder if he saw in Loehe a little bit of a second coming of the way Stephan had been, where Stephan was just apparently, in some respects, a very warm, gentle, pastoral man. Loehe was certainly a very pastoral man, but underneath that kind of soft exterior, there was an underlying suspicious, lack of clear theology, personality there, and so I kind of suspect that that's how Walther viewed Loehe, as the second coming of Stephan in some respects. He does talk about Grabau being that way when it comes to Grabau's dictatorial nature. But Stephan had two faces, and I wonder if he felt Loehe was a little bit two-faced as well. So that seems to have been where Walther really stood when it came to his relationship with Loehe. Did he not show his customary patience? Certainly he went over with Wyneken and visited with Loehe. And when that trip was all said and done, when you read the trip report, he's publicly reporting very glowing things when it's all said and done, that our relationship with Loehe is strong and we're going to move forward together. He does write some private letters, one particularly to his wife that unfortunately got published in Der Lutheraner, where he did from very early on, again, express some real concerns about Loehe's theological approach to these open questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in his heart of hearts, he was always a little bit suspicious that Loehe was never going to be very assertive when it came to what it is that we believe, teach, and confess about these things. It was always going to be open-ended, and he just saw that as undercutting finally all theology.
Yeah, it's always case by case. I kind of asked that question because, it seemed as if, well, as long as they're not we established in the last episode, making the distinction between a weak and a persistent brother. And if Loehe is actually not, say, well, don't tie me down to that position. That's just what I think. Loehe's stance in a lot of these things was
right,
kind of that open question thing where, it could be open. But it's, it seems like Walther came to the conclusion, well, you could still be persistently mushy on something.
Right.
And that's the problem.
And he did very much make the distinction, sure, between weak brother, persistent errorist, but he always eliminated, he would say over and over again, but I'm not talking about an open questions approach. It's one thing if someone just doesn't know better, they don't get it, they don't understand it, they don't understand what we're saying, the scriptures say. It's an entirely different thing when someone says, well, I understand what you're teaching, and I even, and Loehe too. He was willing to admit, you can read the Lutheran confessions the way that Walther reads them. You can understand them that way. In fact, Walther has Luther on his side, Loehe said. But I disagree with that. And so he would have put Loehe in the category of a guy not who's just necessarily fuzzy, but who understands the points that are being made and just says, I don't agree with them. And with that, Walther certainly would have had less patience. At that point, you begin to say, I'm not sure that this is a weak brother. I really think we got to put this person more into the category of a stubborn errorist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems there's more of that weak brother. I don't know. Does it always go hand in hand with just ignorance? I think is maybe the key ingredient.
Yeah, ignorance or lack of training. I mean, with some of these Loehe men that came over, Walther was very patient with them because he says, essentially, these are just greenhorns. These guys just haven't had the opportunity. Of course, the training they got from Loehe, a lot of these guys went through a complete crash course just to come over and serve these Germans who were in need of some type of spiritual help or pastoring. And so he was very, very patient with folks who've just really not had an opportunity to think these things through. But I think he gained the impression of Loehe. Loehe, it's not that he's uneducated or he hasn't thought this all out. It's that we're just going in two different ways, down two divergent paths. And Loehe was unwilling, it seems, to put aside his idea of this doctrinal development open questions, because again, Walther would say, well, where does that end? At what point do we say, okay, now the doctrinal development has stopped, now there are no longer any open questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's pretty clear you couldn't put Loehe in the undereducated, thoughtful category. Right. He was very thoughtful, very prolific in his writings, and
for sure,
yeah. So he's a little bit different case than those guys who got sent over. So switching gears a little bit, and this is kind of more my personal interest coming through here, but he does appear quite prominently in your book after probably in the top 5 figures. Is it fair to say that next to Walther, that Friedrich Wyneken had the biggest role in developing Missouri's fellowship practice? Go ahead.
Yeah. I would say no question about it. Walther was, not that Wyneken was at all a second-rate theologian. Walther was the brains behind the operation. There were certainly other gifted men. And maybe I should even take that back. when you read the histories of those early men, there's always the suggestion that Führerbringer was actually the smartest guy in the room always. But the difficulty that Führerbringer had was he was too smart for everyone and kind of talked over people's heads. Walther had this ability to take all of this information and present it in a way and illustrate it in a way where it just clicked for people. I mean, he just had the wonderful gift of preaching and teaching. That's just clear from everything you read. Wyneken, I think, was probably a step ahead when it came to the matter of pastoral care and patience. Of course, Wyneken comes from really a completely different background, pastorally speaking, and has experiences in the Synod of the West and General Synod that Walther certainly did not have. So yes, in a lot of ways, Wyneken was very much on the front lines when it came to the development of Missouri's doctrine and practice of church fellowship, how they came to stand eventually.
Yeah, so could you tell us a bit about his impact and participation in these fellowship matters? He wasn't really directly in the whole Buffalo Synod thing. It was kind of before he comes on the scene. He's definitely involved with Loehe. But what more can you say?
Yeah, and he really was involved in Buffalo, not from the earliest written brief days, but certainly in the 1850s when he was already the Synod president. Buffalo made a number of for lack of a better way of saying it, efforts, I guess you would say, to try and engage the Missourians and offer them what they called peace proposals. The problem with their so-called peace proposals were always that the first thing that Missouri would have to do is have the pastors that were serving ex-Buffalo congregational members admit that they had done something wrong by starting to serve these folks that had been excommunicated, and Missouri was never going to do that. But apparently Wyneken really believed that Buffalo was making a sincere attempt to try and resolve some of these issues, and was, I guess, probably a bit more willing to compromise with the Buffalo guys. And Walther was more uncompromising in that respect. So he was in that respect very involved in those kind of Buffalo conversations. I would say Wyneken's overriding concern of, as he looked at the Missourians as they were developing, was that while he, of course, with Walther and the others, treasured the fact that the Missourians had been given this wonderful gift of doctrine and understanding of doctrine and presentation of doctrine, that he was beginning to observe pretty quickly, especially in the second generation of pastors, this kind of haughty spirit, like we're Missouri and we've got it right, and a lack of pastoral care and concern for folks who just haven't had the same opportunity to learn what the Missourians had an opportunity to learn and share with one another. And so he saw Walther maybe unsuspectingly contributing to that, especially when he read some of the things he did, some of the ways that Walther treated people in publications like Der Lutheraner and Lehre und Vera, that he just really felt that Missouri could tone down on its polemics and probably get a bit further with folks. He very much understood that the harder you push someone, generally speaking, the more resistant they become, the more they push back. And maybe a softer approach could actually win some people over to what it is that we really want to share with them. So in that respect, again, he was a good curb for Walther, and I think Walther certainly learned some things from him, no doubt.
Yeah, do you want to describe their professional relationship a bit more? It seems that, well, Walther really got burned by Stephan. Like, he seems like Martin Stephan was the closest non-familial relationship Walther had and got burned big time. So he's suspicious of Grabau. Your theory is that he's suspicious of Loehe, and I would agree with that from what I've seen. What about Wyneken? Wyneken's the president from 1850 to 1864. That's when a lot of this major stuff is going down. Was there tension felt there, or was it some kind of a very, I don't know, what do you want to call it?
Yeah, not only the president, but he was his pastoral associate. I mean, Wyneken was Walther's vicar. I mean, that's what they called him. He was called to be Walther's substitute, because Walther was still technically the pastor at Trinity St. Louis while he was serving as the president and professor at the seminary. So Wyneken was his stand-in in the pulpit on many Sundays. So they worked together side by side. I forget exactly. You would know better than me when Wyneken left Trinity St. Louis. When did he go back to Fort Wayne?
Yeah.
Do you know the year?
Well, and this is where your family history and mine cross paths. It was 1850 was when he went to St. Louis. Then 1859 is when I think in Der Lutheraner, there's my mailing address has changed. That's when we see it's moved back to the Fort Wayne area. So it's just a little subtle clue. And then the guys at the Wyneken house in the Friedheim area, I don't know if it was carbon dating or some other way to date the wood, and they said it was felled in either 1858 or 1859 for that house.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I believe we were talking earlier. Your family had owned that house after the Wynekens. Is that true?
Yeah. Yes. When the Wynekens moved to Cleveland in 1864, I think it was, my great grandparents Prange purchased that home from the Wynekens. I think it was built on land that Mrs. Wyneken had inherited from her father, and they lived in that house, I think, close to 20 years, as it turned out. So,
and now it's a museum. Yeah,
and now it's a museum. So the Prange house has been restored. But
I don't think they call it that. But
I don't think they call it that. No,
they could.
But I do wonder. I haven't really dug into that at all. But I do wonder if, again, for lack of a better way of saying it, that Wyneken may have just kind of gotten fed up to some degree with Walther and said it's time to go serve someplace else.
Yeah. Well, and it's just, I mean, that's the impression that I see today. And maybe it's just people oversimplifying things, but they say, well, Walther was the leader of the Missouri Synod pretty much from its founding until his death, when factually speaking, that just wasn't true on paper. I mean, I don't want to downplay it, but he was just the editor of these periodicals. He was just the seminary president professor.
Right.
Very important, very influential, but he certainly didn't stand alone.
For sure.
Yeah, I wonder that too, if there was just, we need to give each other some space. But I haven't really, my research kind of stopped at 1850. So I'm kind of ignorant of that too.
Right. And there are a couple letters in the Matt Harrison volume at home in the house of my fathers, letters between Walther and Wyneken, when both of them went through a time of depression. Mm-hmm. Walther had to take a sabbatical in 1860, and Wyneken in 1863 was really struggling with his Anfechtungen, his depression. Mm-hmm. And it seems clear that 1863 letter that he writes to Walther, like there had been a rub between these guys, and there's certainly, I wouldn't say there was any need for reconciliation. Wyneken certainly expresses his love for Walther, but there was definitely some personal rub there, as is not at all atypical between any two human beings, much less Lutheran pastors in fellowship with one another.
Yeah, and both they're both natural leaders, and as you pointed out, in different ways. So just the different ways that they would naturally lead would cause some tension. So, and
they were Germans. They were both Germans.
Yes, and from different regions too. So there's probably a little competition. Yeah, I don't know. That's something I would like to get into my own studies personally. But yeah, I think that's just interesting, though. As Walther maybe had a lot of difficulties, it seems, getting along with other leader figures. That wasn't necessarily the case, that it would cause a breakdown. Sometimes I think he's portrayed as this stubborn, rigid, uncompromising German who couldn't get along with anyone who didn't totally agree with him. And
right.
You've demonstrated pretty amply in your book that was certainly not the case. And I think the Wyneken dynamic is another good example too.
Right. No, when you read his letters, you're struck by how magnanimous he was, his personality, and just really how positive he was and how encouraging he was. Even sometimes with people who maybe were upset with him, he could butter you up, for lack of a better way of saying it. He seemed to have been very, very pastoral and just had a really winning, charismatic personality, which he had to have because he wasn't a terribly good-looking man.
No, he was not. He didn't age well either. Let's put it that way. Yeah. Well, good. Well, I think on one hand, we could talk about doctrines and controversies, but at the end of the day, it's about people getting along, or Christians getting along with other Christians. And,
sure.
And I appreciate how your book brought that out fully. So next question, what about Walther made him seem complex, if not controversial, among his own peers within his synod? You have some interesting quotes towards the end of your book, I think.
Yeah, and I have to admit, when I looked at that question, I was trying to think maybe what did you see in the volume that made you think that way? Give me a little bit more insight into what your question's getting at. And
now I'm put on the spot. It's like,
is that right?
What was I thinking? No, I think there was no, it's fine. I think there was a quote. Was it a Pieper quote? One of his former students?
Oh, right. August Pieper.
Yeah.
And I guess that's right. August would say, former student, there was a similarity between Walther and Luther in that respect, where Luther too, much like Walther, could just really be a real winning personality, just the kind of guy that you always wanted to be around, except when you didn't want to be around him. I mean, that he could get a spur in his saddle or a burr in his saddle and not be a very friendly guy. So I think what Pieper was getting at, and certainly what others identified, including Wyneken, about him, was his polemics. Very typical for that day and age too. But his polemics, when he pulled out the sword and turned its point toward you were going to feel it. Mm-hmm. And probably he could have demonstrated a bit more skill sometimes when it came to calling a spade and trying to win someone over to the truth. Now, that being said, it's easy to say, well, he should have handled that situation better. But I think of the example of where he was just merciless in the 1860s on the Iowa Synod. Mm-hmm. And his being merciless and just he kept driving the point home, especially this concern about the open questions. Mm-hmm. It did get them to the table. It did get them to finally say, maybe we need to rethink how we're saying these kinds of things. So there was some development there. There were some corrections that were made there. And so you could argue, if Walther had been compromising, who knows where Missouri would have gone? Maybe they would have gone more in the direction of open questions. So it's always easy, 20/20 hindsight, to say it should have been different. But you never know. History is interesting that way because it goes only one direction. You don't get an opportunity to replay it and see how it would go differently had you made other decisions.
Yeah, and you and I as pastors, especially with your years more of experience, we just know there's not always a textbook answer of what to do.
Right.
Case by case. Growing up, I used to think there was,
Right.
The way I like our catechism instruction because it does make things seem pretty black and white. But
right.
Now that I'm thinking back, I'm like, when I learned that lesson, I do remember my pastor saying this, and it wasn't as simple as I tried to make it. And that's what we see in history. Of course, the hindsight is not always 2020 either. We think it is. We think it's 2020, but it's still not. But we don't have all the information.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to it. And again, going back to just how I even titled this book, Wielding the Sword of the Spirit, what Walther would say is, let's not sweep this underneath the rug. Let's handle it. If it means that we need to fight about it, let's fight about it. If it means that we can come to an agreement, of course, that's wonderful. But the worst approach that we can take toward it is an approach of indifference, where we just say, oh, it doesn't matter. Let's just agree to disagree. Because he identified that as the very unionism that he and his fellow Saxons were fleeing in Germany. He was a passionate guy, and he felt like this is a matter of life and death. This matters. We cannot be indifferent toward this. So we got to be out there on the battlefield, engaging people with the sword of the Spirit. And yeah, that's a proclamation of law and gospel. That means drilling down on this theology as best we can together, and not just having it be a willy-nilly open question kind of, well, let's just agree to disagree and say that it's fine for two people to teach different things and we don't really know what the truth is. That leads to destruction, Walther realized.
So in hindsight, we maybe could say that Walther and others weren't always successful in making the right distinction between case by case, but I think, would you agree with the statement that he was fairly consistent in his approach with people?
Yeah, and again, of course, even the word consistent means that there's some rule or a law, and Walther would say, in a lot of ways, if you're a consistent pastor, you're probably not a very good pastor. Pastoral care, by definition, oftentimes has to be inconsistent because you're dealing with two situations that might seem identical, but they're two different people with two different backgrounds, and you have to handle those things differently. And sometimes I think pastors get themselves into real difficulty by saying, well, I have to be consistent here. Of course, it can go the other way too, obviously, but real pastoral care, real application of law and gospel, there are going to be natural inconsistencies to that. Of course, Jesus himself is an example of that. He often overturned the apple cart in terms of how best to do pastoral care, or at least what the thinking for that day was. So, yeah, I really do think that in his heart of hearts, Walther believed that using the sharpest point of the sword was obviously for the good of the person that he was addressing with that pointed sword. The only way you were going to overcome a stubborn errorist was by making the sword as sharp as you could possibly make it. And it was not at all meant to destroy that person. Certainly it was meant to destroy their false teaching. But the hope, the prayer was that the sharp edge of the word of God would finally break through this person's heart and mind and bring them to repentance and help them see what the truth actually is. But yes, on the other hand, when it came to folks who were weak in their understanding or their faith, he seems to have had a very gentle pastoral heart towards those folks. You hear some anecdotal stories that I've never been able to confirm in writing, but one I heard, I don't know if I mentioned this on the last time we were together, that there apparently was a man in the St. Louis area probably who had been excommunicated from his congregation because he had a drinking problem. And Walther ran into this man at some point and said, "You come to my church, I'll give you communion." So he was really apparently quite liberal when it came to his pastoral practice. He understood that people struggle with sin and lack of understanding, and he was really, really gentle towards folks from what you read. But yes, when someone should know better, he was gonna nail him with the sharp edge of the sword, no question.
All right. Well, we didn't cover every single episode or issue or case study, kind of intentionally. We want people not only to hear you talk about your book, but to pick it up for themselves and read it and have it as a steady reference. So now we're going to switch gears here, and go away from the factual content of what you present and just talk more about the history, research, and writing process. So while your book is about the doctrine and practice of fellowship in the Missouri Synod as a whole, it's pretty obvious your book is very focused on CFW Walther especially. And you chose to end each chapter with an example of Walther's fellowship practice or instructions to others. So in a way, and this is my impression, the book kind of reads like a biography of Walther, almost as much as it is a life story of the Missouri Synod. So was this Walther-centric, is a term I'm going to use, Walther-centric focus your original intent or design for the book, or is that just kind of the way it turned out?
It certainly was not originally my intent. I will readily admit one of the disadvantages that I have in researching and writing about 18th century history and 19th century history, Lutheran history in general, is I'm not a German scholar. I have 2 years of high school German, and that is it. So Google Translate is my friend. Mm-hmm. And so the fact of the matter is, the material that is available in English coming out of Concordia Publishing House is largely stuff that has been translated from Walther. And of course, that's understandable, being the really the founder and father of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and being such a central figure to their doctrinal positions and the way they approach church and ministry in that century. So if by default Walther becomes a central figure, I'm thankful to have some good family and friends who are better at German than I am. So, in my reading of secondary sources, there might be some references to some article in Der Lutheraner by Wyneken or Seeler or, this person. And so I might ask them to translate some pages for me. And of course, what I find is, to go back to that word, a lot of consistency between what others were writing and what Walther himself was writing and saying. So it became clear to me that saying or presenting Walther's point of view as the Missourian point of view was pretty safe. I mean, in the Missouri Synod of those days, what Walther said, the Missouri Synod said, pretty much a one-for-one relationship there. So
yeah, fair enough.
Yep, that's really largely why it became, as you put it, Walther-centric. Now,
for the earlier chapter of your book, you had to set the stage, the context, and it's really hard to overestimate the role of that Stephanite immigration and controversy in formulating how the rest of the book goes. There's the rather dated but still widely known and respected book by Forster called Zion on the Mississippi, and that was one of your main sources. Now, I haven't read it in probably over 10 years now, so I wasn't too familiar with its arguments anymore. But do you see yourself as using his work just as a handy tool to summarize and cite what was going on, or did you offer any different interpretations to him as you were reading his history?
Yeah, I basically used him just really from because he has so many references to primary sources. I mean, it's just chocked full of so much information. It's astonishing the amount of work that he put into that book. Before the internet too. Yeah, it's just astonishing. The other volume that very much deals with those years was one written in the published in the 1940s by Concordia by a guy named Karl Mundinger. It was, I think, his doctoral thesis that was then made into a book, and Concordia had plans to publish a whole series of books about the history of Missouri. It's unfortunate it never got done. I think his and maybe another one, I forget which, were really the only two that were ever published in that series. I've read somewhere, I can't remember where, that Forster was criticized or critiqued as, his volume seemed to have as one of its main goals to cut Walther down to size, and to there was a lot of Walther worship or adoration in the Missouri Synod, and to demonstrate that Walther doesn't come out of this whole thing very squeaky clean at all. And it is a little bit hard to believe, those early pastors who were close followers of Stephen, when the whole Stephen debacle takes place, they all kind of plead ignorance, like we didn't know any of this was going on, and we didn't realize that as his henchmen, so to speak, we were kind of doing this huge power grab. When again, it's a little bit hard to believe that they didn't have enough of their eyes open to see there was a lot of there was a lot of money being thrown around, and they were undoubtedly benefiting from that as his right hand men to a degree as well. So they certainly had a spiritual concern that brought them to America, but one wonders if there was a little bit of materialism going on there as well. So, and I think Forster does, without necessarily saying that, kind of suggest that while Stephen is certainly responsible for the lion's share of that, others were guilty as well, and Walther too. And Mundinger doesn't so much get into that. My recollection reading his volume is he would probably argue a bit more that Stephen really pulled the wool over these guys' eyes, and that there was just something really, well, it was the era of the Second Great Awakening. There was just a spiritual spirit going on there, where people were more susceptible, I guess. I don't know. Maybe it's not true, but more susceptible to being duped. I guess folks today are being duped aplenty. So right. I'm maybe I shouldn't say that.
Maybe that's just, instead of the Nigerian prince of today, the email scams back then. Yeah. The main scam, if not, was maybe a snake oil salesman or the false preacher, and those were the scams back then.
Right.
So
right.
Yeah. Well, interesting on your take on that. I think Tim Grunmeyer and I have talked about doing Zion on the Mississippi as a potential history of history book talk sometime. I think, and I appreciate your insight on that, what you saw, because that's a good one. Well, let's go back to your that was part of your process, but you used many more sources than that. You used a lot of primary and secondary. Now, did you have a plan or method concerning? Okay, now I'm going to go to the original sources, but now I'm going to rely on the secondary.
Yeah. Again, a lot of that just had to do with, certainly as a historian, I think primary sources are always the key sources. Obviously, you don't want to read somebody else's interpretation of what someone else did or wrote or said. So ideally, going back to the primary sources is just always going to be your best bet. But where either the primary source wasn't available to me, or where it was available, but just in a language that I'm not familiar with, or as familiar as I would like to be, then in those cases, I would have to rely on a secondary source. And, you try and compare secondary sources that treat the same material, and try and drill down based upon what you find in those secondary sources to figure out maybe where the truth actually lies. Everybody comes to history, obviously, with a natural agenda. I mean, you're trying to prove something. And so you're naturally going to latch on to evidence and secondary sources, even primary sources, which seem to prove your argument. And you're going to say, well, maybe we can ignore what doesn't necessarily fit into the narrative that I am trying to present here. So I realize that about myself, and I realize that about secondary sources. So I do, when making use of those secondary sources, try to get my hands on as many of them as possible in an effort to find that golden mean of truth.
Yeah, and it's always the historian's balancing act to try to get it all in the right perspective. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And, just for anyone who's doing their own history, it's that the back of the book is almost the most exciting part. It's like, oh, did this writer uncover something I never heard of or seen before, especially in the primary source world.
Right.
So yeah, that was always fun for me to look through that. And I saw some interesting stuff in your source list as well. Now this, I don't know, I maybe could have asked this question earlier, and this might be a question I've been meaning to ask for a couple decades now, but I just hear this word thrown out there, and I don't know if I've ever been given a solid definition, and I wonder if you could help me out with that. You frequently use the word evangelical, and that's a type of American Protestantism today, but you don't mean it that way at all.
Right.
You use it to describe an attitude or a thought or an action. So what do you and maybe what do other people in our circles mean by that?
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the easiest way to define evangelical is in your dealings with another person, you always keep the ultimate goal in mind, which is that Jesus loves this person and died for this person and wants this person to be in heaven. God wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. And especially as a pastor, but certainly just as a Christian too, that should be our same goal. What is it going to take? Not that, of course, it's my work; it's the Spirit's work through words that I proclaim or that others might proclaim to this person, that is going to lift the veil of unbelief from this person's eye, or this veil of sin that they currently have found themselves under and are confused and thrown off by life circumstances or whatever, that just to have that heart of love and concern. Now, of course, sometimes that means that you have to exercise some tough love. Good, godly, tough love is 100% evangelical, because the goal is not to crush and destroy, but to cause a person to recognize that they need a solution to this problem of sin that they have found themselves in. And again, to use that word to describe Walther, I'm convinced that when Walther was his sharpest, that he, in his heart of hearts, the reason why he was being so sharp was because he saw just how much danger this person that he was dealing with was putting themselves in eternally because of their approach to God's word. And so if that means that I have to take out this very sharp sword in an effort to win them for the truth, then that's what I need to do. I need to be evangelical. So yeah, it's evangelical certainly does not mean that, as some people put it, we always err on the side of the gospel. While that might be true, that we show patience and we bear with one another in love, and we make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. I mean, those are all true. Being truly evangelical is to properly distinguish between law and gospel, and to understand how patiently and sometimes how vigorously we need to apply that, especially as pastors, in the lives of people that God has called us to serve with those things.
Yeah, thank you. That probably fills in a few areas where I've heard it used that way, but haven't had like a solid definition for it, and that's appreciated. And my problem is, well, of course, I know literally it's a reference to the gospel, right?
Sure.
It is what it's talking about, but the way that it's used, kind of like an adjective or even an adverb, in our circles, we use that in a very specific way, and I appreciate you sharing that.
Right.
In other contexts, it just means Protestant.
Right.
This is the evangelical church. Well, it's the Protestant church in Germany,
Right.
So when doing history, it's important to understand how that same single word could mean many different things.
Right. And of course, in our American culture, the evangelicals oftentimes are some of the most legalistic preachers and people in the world.
And that's why it's confusing. Yeah,
exactly right.
So and this might be a rabbit hole. This could be a whole nother paper or a topic. But are you aware of where's the origin of people using the word evangelical and the way you've used and defined it? Does that begin all the way back with Luther? Or is this a more recent thing? Are you aware of that?
I mean, Luther, of course, wanted to my recollection, Luther wanted his followers to be called evangelicals. Mm-hmm. We preach the gospel. Yeah. And again, when you study Luther's pastoral practice, really astonishingly liberal, where he was willing to bend over backwards. One of the most famous examples of that, of course, was his advice to Philip of Hesse that Philip should just marry his girlfriend and be married to two people. And, to his dying day, Walther was not happy that became public, but to his dying day, apparently, he always felt like that was the most evangelical pastoral advice I could give. That was just the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. Luther and Walther both were astonishingly pastoral, evangelical, really quite, understanding I'm dealing with a sinner here. I'm dealing with a broken person here. And that doesn't mean that I just condone their sin, but I also have to take a person where they're at in an effort to, with law and gospel, bring them on this road that leads to everlasting life.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more just about the research method. I think you've kind of laid that out there, as well as the challenges, especially the languages are always going to be a challenge for anyone working with something not in their native language. I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about the research method or challenges. If not, do you got anything you want to add?
I mean, no surprise, just lots and lots of reading. And for me, rereading, I do not have a photographic memory. So even when I read my own book, sometimes I'm surprised by stuff I find in there. Like, I don't know if I ever knew that. And it's like, I wrote this, didn't I?
Yeah.
So just lots of reading and rereading and taking notes and, outlining, where you're throwing your references, you're finding these things, and it's literally like putting a 10,000 piece puzzle together, where at first you think that's going to fit there, and it doesn't quite fit there, but you do find someplace else in your writing or research where it's going to fit. So it's just a lot of legwork. There's just no question about it.
Was there any discovery in your research that just surprised or excited you? Kind of like, here's that missing piece of the puzzle I've been looking for.
I had already done enough reading in, some of this history of the Missourians to know that I was going to find a lot of the things that I eventually found. But it was always just kind of reassuring, of course, when you've kind of developed a thesis or a thought in your head, and then you find this new document, this new letter, this new writing, where it just confirms it for you. And so, especially in this project, as I was doing my research, it was just really reassuring, like you're on the right track. And not just with Walther's writings, but when you read some of these other Missourians and their writings. And of course, you see some of the same tensions as well. Not everybody in the Missouri Synod in Walther's day was that excited about his approach to church fellowship, it seems. Clearly there were going to be people on both ends of that spectrum, some who maybe wanted it to be more open than it was, and some who wanted it to be even stricter than the reputation that a lot of Missourians had. But again, in my reading over the years, I had already drawn the conclusion, these Missourians aren't nearly as exclusive as the moniker that many have given to them. They were serious about their doctrine. There's no question about it. But they made very, very careful distinctions in their relationships with folks. And probably the one thing that was most eye-opening for me that I had never really grasped was that deep impact that the Stephan relationship and that whole debacle had, and the concern that was expressed by these early Saxons, especially their fear of Donatism. They really believed that they had become Donatists, like we are the true church on earth, and essentially that apart from us there is no church. And they feared that separatism, that sectarianism, that Donatism, and it drove Walther and these other early Missourians literally to reach out to other folks, not just Lutherans either, to folks there in Missouri who were looking for a preacher, and they would send them someone even though they weren't Lutherans, and they wouldn't expect those folks to sign on some dotted line before they were willing to serve them with the gospel. They knew this was going to take some time, as they had this new opportunity to share the truth with these folks. So they were willing to take people into their fellowship who weren't, necessarily at the same level of theological instruction that they were at.
So finally, as we near the end of our discussion today, do you have any unanswered questions about your own topic? Kind of a scratch or an itch you couldn't scratch?
I mean, of course, there are all kinds of things that you wish you had the time and ability to dig into further. Just the volume of material, even in a publication like Der Lutheraner alone. Yeah. I mean, that was coming out on a bi-monthly basis, and not at all to denigrate the type of magazines that our synod puts out, like Forward in Christ. But I mean, Der Lutheraner certainly had newsy items, but it was a theological journal, and it wasn't fluffy stuff. No. And so you
no pictures either.
No pictures, right? Yeah. Other than the masthead.
Right.
So one just wishes that you could just take those off the shelf. They're on the shelf there in the periodical room of the library at our Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. It's fascinating to me that you can pull a volume of Der Lutheraner off the shelf from 1844. You just handle it yourself.
Yeah.
I can't believe that's just publicly accessible. But anyway, you just wish you could sit down and just read that stuff. And of course, I can't. I'd love to be able to. So sure, there are all kinds of things that you say, there's more information there, but it's just not accessible to me. It's just not. So you take what you can get, and who knows, the rest of that sadly might just lie there unlocked in the German language for the generations to come. I pray that someday you can put a page of German on a copier screen, and it, instead of just copying what's there, it'll print out a translation for you. It'd be wonderful.
Yeah. I don't know. That seems like we're pretty close.
Getting closer, right?
But that Fraktur old script is kind of tough on the eyes. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But Google Books, if you find Der Lutheraner, you could they can read that. So yeah, we're pretty close. But
right,
translation though, the artificial intelligence isn't always going to be able to make the right call.
Right.
A lot of that
but
stuff.
It Google Translate, as I say, that released, my friend.
Oh, I've
again,
used that too. Yeah.
Yep. I'm
It's been
certainly not a
helpful.
German scholar, but it's astonishing to me when I put that into Google Translate and send it off to somebody who knows German. They'll certainly make some corrections to it, but
Mhm.
it's not as if you have no clue what this is saying when you throw it into Google Translate. It is really an astonishing tool.
Yeah, at least it could help, you understand what the content is a bit more and realize,
Exactly.
okay, is this worth translating or not? Or
Right.
do I know this
Exactly.
already? Yeah. Oh,
Yep.
cool. Well, is there any specific area of research, like an angle or a question, you think there's more potential work to be done on this topic of Missouri and fellowship practice?
Well, I'm in the process of writing a second volume that will take this, and the second volume is really 1868 to 1882, where you really might say have the not really the end of the predestination controversy or election controversy, but it's kind of, that's where a split began to happen within the Synodical Conference. But the second volume is the doctrine and practice of the Synodical Conference, which of course was founded in 1872. So right now I'm in the early chapter and looking at how, of course, Missouri turned away from the General Council, as did the Ohio Synod, and eventually they, with Wisconsin and the Norwegian and Illinois and Minnesota, came together to form the Synodical Conference. And the fact of the matter is, there are lots of doctrinal issues, but the main issue is church fellowship. I mean, what is the level of agreement necessary for churches to come into formal church fellowship? I mean, that was just really always seemed to be kind of the crux of the discussion. That's what it all revolved around. And I'm approaching that second volume, and even the election controversy. The election controversy was obviously about the doctrine of election, but what did it immediately involve? The doctrine and practice of church fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
How does this affect our church fellowship? And I have found some very interesting things in that whole, especially that controversy, the history of that whole controversy, which frankly, primary source stuff, I have not found in any treatments of the election controversy. And one thing that has surprised me there, and of course, this will maybe be for a later episode whenever I get that finally finished.
Mm-hmm.
Walther certainly had his opponent, F.A. Schmidt, in the election controversy. And they were going at one another. But Walther always made the point, he repeatedly made the point, if this could have remained a private discussion, there would have been no break of church fellowship. That doctrine itself, that difference in perspective on that doctrine, which is a hard doctrine, would not have been divisive of church fellowship. What made it divisive was the fact that Schmidt made it divisive by going public and bringing this into congregations and dividing congregations. That was really the issue. And again, when you read the histories of the election controversy, they very much emphasize the doctrinal difference, but it was in many respects a practical difference. When you have disagreements like this, how do you handle it? And I also have studied in Wisconsin Synod history the Protestant controversy. That's family history for me. And and I did that years ago. But the more I think about even the Protestant controversy that happened 40 years later, I say to myself, that Protestant controversy really happened because of the election controversy. It was this divisiveness. It was this unbrotherliness that really led to that separation. So it again, it's very informative in terms of for our own day. When we have disagreements between one another, brothers, even some doctrinal questions that might come up, the really important question is, how are we going to handle this? Are we going to deal with one another in brotherly love, or are we going to make it a big public divisive issue? And there's just a lot to learn from those controversies, a lot to learn from this history for sure. Just in terms of how we deal with one another in love.
Yes, and your historical work definitely raises some current daily questions, and I think that's the most useful kind of history.
For sure.
Not only is it telling a story, I mean, I'll do that just for the sake of learning more. It's my personality. I like the old stuff.
Sure.
But I mean, this really, it gets at the heart of the church today,
right?
Especially
right.
So, infinitely more valuable when it can do that.
Right.
All right. So that's your upcoming project. Do you have any estimated arrival date? I mean, you kind of have to work on that on the side. So I guess it is what it is.
I have advertised it as coming in 2022 because it's the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Synodical Conference. So
even appropriate.
Even if I can finally put up the link to buy this book on December 31st, 2022, I will consider that as mission accomplished. But I'm currently now starting a new position here where I serve as the school pastor of Kenosha Lutheran Academy, which is a completely new job for me. So I'm still kind of learning on the job, and I enjoy spending time with the kids. So that takes time away from writing books. And of course, I'm a pastor first, and I got to be a writer of history books second for sure. And, got to be a husband and father in there too.
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, in general, kind of your personal interests, I think we know what you're interested in, but what would you like to see more research and writing done on within the topic of Lutheran history?
Yeah, that's a tough one for me to answer. My mind just naturally goes to these kind of high points in Lutheran history. And so whatever material comes out in those eras, I'm always game to dig into that stuff. I was always in history classes that always seemed to get bogged down, and I didn't complain about it, but bogged down in these eras of history. And I don't think I ever had an American history course that actually got to like World War II. So I don't know much about 20th century history other than just kind of the basic stuff. And again, I don't complain about that because I've always been kind of interested in these high points of history. So as far as I'm concerned, those are the eras I'm most interested in. So whatever comes, whatever new information is uncovered in those eras and areas, those are the things that I'm really interested in. I'll just be honest.
Yeah. Well, no one said this to me yet, but I'm starting to joke about it myself. You could almost call this the 19th century American Lutheran history podcast, because that's just the content that people are interested in. That's what I'm researching. That's what I'm interested in. That's the content we'll have. So like I said on a show update episode for our listeners, I maybe want to branch out a little bit, but this is where the material's at. And I think many Lutheran historians would agree there's something very unique about this era and how it forms things even today.
No question about it.
So still very important. So, all right. Well, Pastor Prange, thank you for joining us today again. Talk about your book. We look forward to your next project coming out hopefully next year.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Are you the kind of person who likes to accomplish more than one thing at once? Then you'll probably be interested in checking out the Lutheran History Shop. By purchasing something from our store, you can support the show, get something for yourself, or get a head start on your Christmas shopping and get something unique for that Lutheran history lover in your life. At the bottom of each episode description, you'll find a link to the Lutheran History Shop. There you can browse an assortment of Lutheran history gear and bling, anything from stickers, mugs, pint glasses, water bottles, and totes. There are also many shirts and hoodies that come in dozens of sizes and color options, so you can customize your favorite design. So whether you're looking for a figure from Lutheran history or simply want to display your love for Lutheran history, you'll find what you're looking for at the Lutheran History Shop.